Delphine entered the photographer's room like someone stepping into a confession booth that could also shoot you. Outside, the late afternoon light of the 1870s fell at an angle across the main street. Dust, wagons, and the slow churn of men who had nowhere left to be kind. The town was called a dozen names in the mouths of different people, but in the ledger of the federal officers it was always the same word. A place you held until you could move the next thing through. The sign above the studio swayed on its chain. It read, Elias Gray, Photographs, Memorials, and Likenesses. The last word had been painted over twice. The first painter had gotten bored or scared. The glass in the front window was clean, but the rest of the building looked like it had been through more weather than it had earned. Delphine paused before the curtain that marked the inner room. Her hand rested at her belt where a small pouch sat. A measure of powder and a note folded so tightly the paper had taken the shape of urgency. She told herself she was only there for the photograph. That had been the bargain, if a bargain could exist between grief and a man with a camera. She had been told Elias Gray did portraits for the ones who were leaving. He charged less if you didn't flinch when he moved the plates. He didn't ask for your tribe like some clerk at a courthouse might ask for a surname. Still, she had heard other things. Men said he was a drifter. Women said he was a coward who hid behind the chemistry of silver nitrate. Children said he made ghosts out of faces. Delphine pulled aside the curtain. Inside, the air smelled like chemicals, cloth, and old wood warmed by lamps. A tripod stood in the center of the room like a crooked praying stand. Backdrops hung against the wall, faded canvas painted with a suggestion of sky and trees. The ceiling beams were stained, and in the corners, dust clung like the world's last breath. A man looked up from a counter where a wooden box sat open. He was older than the way his hands moved suggested. His hair had gone nearly colorless at the temples and was longer than it should have been, tangled from a wind that didn't care about grooming. He wore a shirt with sleeves rolled, ink black at the cuffs, and a vest that had seen the inside of more towns than it had seen parlor lamps. His eyes landed on Delphine and didn't skitter away. "Evening," he said, voice roughened by smoke and effort. "You're late." Delphine had not expected bluntness. She had expected a sales pitch. "I was asked to come before the sun broke," she replied. Elias Gray blinked slowly. Then he seemed to take in the bruise-colored shadow under her eyes, the way she held herself as if measuring each step for escape. "Before the sun broke," he repeated, as though tasting the words. "That's how folks talk when they're making a deadline." Delphine didn't correct him. If you corrected a man like Elias, sometimes you forced him to decide whether to remember you. She stepped farther into the studio and let the lamplight find her face. There was no mirror in here, only the camera's lens, the plate holders, and the quiet judgment of chemistry. Elias reached for a cloth to wipe his fingers, but his hand paused halfway. "You're not here for wedding pictures," he said. Delphine's lips tightened. "No." Elias moved around the tripod as though he had done this for people who expected to be lied to. "Then why are you here?" Her throat tightened. She could say it plainly. She needed a record of her existence. She needed something tangible when the world insisted it could erase her from the map. She needed a face that would outlast the men who burned letters and stole names. Instead, she reached for the pouch at her belt and pulled out the folded paper. "I need a picture of what they can't take," she said. Elias didn't reach for the paper. He didn't ask to see it. His refusal to touch it was, in its own way, an answer. "Sit," he said, and nodded to a chair positioned so the light fell across her cheekbone and the crescent scar she had tried to forget. Delphine sat. The chair's wood was cold at first, then the lamplight warmed it, and the room settled into that peculiar silence that always arrived when a lens was raised. Elias adjusted the tripod height. He checked the focus cloth over the lens housing as though he was calming an animal. "You know," he said quietly, "most folks flinch when I ask them to hold still." "I am not most folks," Delphine replied. Elias let out a small breath that might have been a laugh if it hadn't sounded like fatigue. No, he agreed. You're not. He asked her to set her jaw the way he wanted. He asked her to look past the lens as if the camera could catch something that lived behind her eyes. Delphine complied. She had learned compliance from people who didn't have a choice. She had learned stillness, too. Stillness could be a shield. When the shutter clicked, it wasn't loud. Yet it felt like a bell rung in a church that had been empty for years. Delphine watched Elias's hands as he prepared the plate. He moved with practiced care. The chemicals were arranged with a soldier's neatness. A tray here, a bottle there. The negatives in their paper sleeves looked like prayers folded tight. After a second exposure, Elias stepped back. "Done," he said. "You'll come back in a spell for the print. I'll keep the plate safe." Delphine nodded once. "Then you keep your promise," she said. "What promise?" Elias asked, and Delphine realized, too late, that he was genuine. He didn't know which men had sent her, which mouths had shaped the rumor of his mercy. "You're the one who doesn't ask," she said. "The one who lets a woman tell her story without making her swallow it." Elias's eyes darkened. "If I'm that man, you got the right room." Delphine stood. She reached for her pouch again, as if the weight inside could anchor her to the present. "You said the town is dying," she told him. Elias looked away, toward the window where street noise pressed in like restless insects. "Every town's dying," he said. "Some just take longer to admit it." Delphine folded the paper again. "I have 3 days." Elias faced her. "To do what?" Delphine hesitated. Outside, hooves clattered, voices carried, 2 men arguing about a route, about a wagon, about who had the right to stop whose life from going forward. Elias's gaze snapped to the curtain. He didn't say a word, but his whole posture changed. Less studio man, more survivor. 3 days, he echoed, and the repetition sounded like calculation. Delphine answered softly, "To decide whether I run or whether I stand between bullets and someone else." Elias's throat bobbed. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said. Delphine held his eyes. "You will." Before she could move toward the door, the curtain jerked aside. 2 men entered, both with the kind of certainty that came from being certain you were allowed to hurt. They wore bad boots and better hats. One had a badge pinned to his vest, federal, or what pretended to be federal when the world wanted to call violence official. The other had a rifle with the barrel scrubbed clean. He was young enough to think he would never need mercy. Elias stood between Delphine's chair and the doorway without even knowing he had done it. The man with the badge looked from Delphine to Elias as if choosing which one to blame for an inconvenience. "Gray," the man said, "we're told you've been getting visitors who don't belong." Elias's face remained calm, but his hands hovered near the counter where the plate holders sat. "Visitors belong where they're invited," Elias said. The badge man's eyes narrowed. "You invited this one?" Delphine didn't answer. Elias answered for her. "I invited her to sit for a portrait. That's what my sign says." The young man with the rifle snorted. "Portrait? That's a fine way to hide contraband." Delphine's pulse hammered in her ears. Elias's glance flickered just once toward her pouch. The badge man leaned forward. "We ain't here for art. We're here for the paper you've been keeping for her." Elias's mouth tightened. "She didn't show me any paper." The badge man smiled, but his teeth didn't match his expression. "Then you don't know what she came to do." Delphine took a slow breath and felt it snag on anger, because she had not just come for herself. There was a child at the edge of town who carried her aunt's bracelet like a talisman. There was a medicine woman who had taught Delphine how to speak without begging. There were names that would vanish if she didn't nail them to paper. She stepped toward the men, careful not to make sudden moves. "I came to be remembered," Delphine said. "If you want to burn my face, you'll have to carry the heat yourself." The rifleman lifted his barrel a fraction. Elias's voice hardened. "Put that down." The badge man laughed. "Why? You gonna take the bullet for her? You got a hero complex?" Elias's eyes flashed, and in that moment Delphine saw something under the man's exhaustion, something sharp and old. "I don't take bullets," Elias said. "I take photographs." The badge man's smile widened. "Then take this." He stepped forward and reached for the counter. Elias moved fast, not in a brawl way, but in a practiced way. He grabbed the counter edge and shoved a stack of plate sleeves toward the back cabinet. The badge man's hand caught on the edge of the cabinet door, and in the chaos, Delphine saw what Elias tried to hide. Not paper, a ledger. Not the kind used for commerce, but the kind used to record names and dates like a promise to the dead. Delphine realized suddenly that Elias Gray wasn't just documenting the dying West, he was collecting the names that the West tried to erase. The badge man yanked the cabinet open. His eyes landed on Elias's handwriting. "You keep records," the badge man said, voice turning from smug to alarmed. Elias's hands spread, palms visible. "Records are not crimes." The rifleman shifted his grip. "It is when they show who you been helping." Delphine stared at Elias, and something in her chest shifted. Elias hadn't asked her tribe. He hadn't asked for her story. He hadn't pressed for details. But he had already begun to write what the world demanded be silent. The badge man snapped the ledger shut. "You're under suspicion, Gray." Elias's shoulders went still. "For taking pictures?" "For hiding," the badge man said. Delphine spoke before she could stop herself. "What are you searching for?" The rifleman turned his head toward her, eyes calculating. "For the man who calls himself Gray." Delphine felt the floor of her understanding tilt. Elias Gray, not his name. The badge man's voice sharpened. "You ever hear the name Eli Gray? Elias Gray? Or is it just what you use when you want people to think you're harmless?" Elias didn't flinch. He looked at the men as if he had learned long ago that fear was a currency he couldn't afford. "Men call me what makes sense to them," Elias said. "I answer to the sound of my own work." The badge man took a step closer. "That's a lie." Delphine's mouth went dry. Because Elias's calm was no longer only stubbornness, it was rehearsal. The men left the studio with the sound of their boots and the certainty of a decision they hadn't yet named. When the curtain settled back into place, Delphine remained seated, staring at the cabinet Elias had used as a shield. Elias exhaled slowly. His hands shook only slightly, like a man trying not to show how much the shaking cost him. "You knew them," Delphine said. Elias swallowed. "I knew the type." Delphine stood and faced him. "Why help me?" Elias's eyes met hers, and in them she saw guilt with teeth. "I didn't plan on helping you," he said. Delphine's heart tightened. "You're lying." Elias's jaw flexed. "I'm not. I planned on moving on. I planned on taking the portraits and making my life small enough to survive." Delphine waited. Elias rubbed a thumb across his palm as if erasing something invisible. "Then you came," he continued. "You sat down in my chair like you belonged in every frame ever made. And when the men asked after the ledger, I remembered what I wrote." "What you wrote," Delphine echoed. Elias's voice turned low. "A name that wasn't mine." Delphine frowned. "You're afraid of your own name?" Elias's gaze dropped to the scar on her cheekbone. He spoke as if the words scraped his throat. "I was told to forget it. I was told it would keep others from getting hurt." Delphine felt heat rise behind her eyes. "Others," she repeated, and the word turned into a blade. Elias lifted his eyes again. "I don't know what you think I am." Delphine stepped closer until she could see the fine lines around his mouth. "I think you are a man who hides behind a camera to keep from admitting he made choices." Elias's breath hitched. Delphine continued, her voice trembling now because anger had become grief's sibling. "Tell me your hidden name." Elias stared at her for a long moment. Then he reached under the counter and pulled out a small, cloth-wrapped item. He unwrapped it slowly. Inside was a cheap brass badge, tarnished and bent at the edges. Delphine's stomach turned. Elias held the badge like it was something alive and dangerous. "This is what I wore," he said. Delphine's voice went thin. "Once." "Yes," Elias replied, "before I became gray." He handed the badge to Delphine carefully, like the metal could burn. On its face was a stamped name. Delphine read it in the lamplight. It wasn't Eli Gray. It was Oren. Oren Gray had been a name Delphine had heard whispered years ago at the edge of reservation lines, spoken not as a person's identity, but as a warning, the man who brought officials through without asking permission. Delphine looked at Elias. The man before her had the same eyes as the stories, but the way Elias held himself now was different, like a person carrying a dead bird in his hands, hoping it still had warmth. "You were him," Delphine said. Elias didn't deny it. "I was there," he admitted. "I saw what they did. I told myself my job was paper and distance. I told myself I couldn't change it." Delphine's hands tightened around the badge. "And now?" Elias's voice cracked just slightly. "Now I try to keep what they steal from coming back empty." Delphine looked down at her scar, at the bruise of memory under her eyes. "You say you record names," she said. "You're afraid of being recognized." Elias nodded once. "I'm afraid of being understood." Delphine's anger shifted into something heavier, something like pity, though she didn't want to grant him that. She was not here to comfort him, but she was also not here to punish him. Life on the frontier taught you that the same act could be both harm and attempt at repair. Delphine returned the badge to him. "They will come again." "I know," Elias said. Delphine walked to the tripod and touched the wood where the shutter latch sat. She ran her fingers over the worn edge. "This chair," she said, "is the only mercy I can afford." "You hide behind it." Elias looked at her hands. "And you? You think you're merciful?" Delphine turned, meeting his eyes. "I came because someone told me you would not ask where I belonged." Elias's expression tightened. "I didn't ask because I wanted you to lie to them. I wanted you to survive your own story." Delphine's throat burned. "What story?" Elias swallowed. "The one they're hunting." As if summoned by their talk, the sound of distant gunfire carried over the town's roofs. Delphine stiffened. Elias moved toward the window and lifted the corner curtain to look outside. "Head west," he murmured. "They're rounding up anyone connected to the last camp." Delphine's pulse pounded so hard she could feel it in her jaw. She understood then. The paper she carried, the folded promise, was not just to be remembered. It was to be delivered. A message, a list of names, a warning. The kind of thing that got women buried in shallow earth because men were too afraid to admit they were wrong. "They think you know where it is," Delphine said. Elias nodded. "They think my old self knows how to keep secrets." Delphine looked at him, really looked. Oren had been a man who wore a badge. Oren had been a man who had walked alongside officials and made cruelty easier by signing his name. Elias Gray was what he became afterward. But Delphine wasn't sure Elias's repentance would be enough to stop bullets. 3 days, she said again, more like a vow now. "I have 3 days to get the message out." Elias's face tightened. "To whom?" Delphine's eyes shifted to the far corner of the studio where a canvas backdrop leaned slightly against the wall. For a moment she imagined pulling it aside and discovering a hiding place that wasn't just paint. "To a man who used to be on your side," she said. Elias stared. "On my—" Delphine cut him off. "On the wrong side." Elias's expression grew distant, as if he were trying to map a memory into a direction his body could still walk. "His name is spoken like a sin," Delphine continued. "Carter." Elias's jaw tensed. "You shouldn't say it," he whispered. Delphine watched him carefully. "You know him." Elias's eyes flickered, then steadied. "I knew him before I stopped calling it law." Delphine let the silence stretch. She could hear the room's old boards creak, and she imagined the whole studio as a fragile boat in floodwater. Then she said, Then help me. Elias shook his head. I can't. Delphine's voice went cold. You already did. You took my picture. You hid the ledger. You stopped them from touching my message. Elias's eyes flashed. I didn't stop them from touching you. Delphine swallowed. You stopped them from touching my story. Elias stared at her as if she had made something unbearable suddenly clear. He reached for the camera case. I'll take you where you need to go, he said, but not as a guide, as a distraction. Delphine's breath caught. You'll get yourself killed. Elias's mouth twisted, almost like bitterness. You think you're the only one with people who want you dead? Delphine wanted to argue. She wanted to say she understood. She wanted to say his life was a debt he could still repay. But the frontier didn't pay debts with words. It paid them with bullets and breath. Delphine nodded once. Elias gathered his things quickly. He wrapped spare plates, shoved chemicals into a leather satchel, and snapped the camera case shut. Then he looked at her. Do you have the message? He asked. Delphine reached into the pouch and pulled out the folded paper. I have it, she said. Elias's gaze lingered on it like a man looking at a match. And if they catch us? He asked. Delphine thought of the child at the edge of town. Thought of names that would die twice, once in life, once in record. If they catch us, Delphine said, you tell them you don't know me. Elias's eyes tightened. I won't do that. Delphine's voice softened, even as fear rose. You have to. It's how you keep yourself alive long enough to protect what comes next. Elias stared at her. That's what I used to tell myself. Delphine stepped close enough to see the faint scar on his knuckles. Then choose different. The words landed between them like a promise neither of them could fully trust. They moved out from the studio through the back alley, where tumbleweeds and broken barrels formed a rough corridor away from the main road. Delphine and Elias walked with purpose. Not too fast. Fast attracted attention. Not too slow. Slow gave men time to notice. As they passed the edge of town, Delphine saw the outline of the church bell tower and the way men gathered near the jail. She caught a glimpse of the badge man from earlier, talking to other officials, pointing with a rigid arm. Elias kept his head down. Delphine watched him anyway. There was something in his posture now that hadn't been there at the counter, a careful humility. A man trying to make amends with every step. It didn't absolve him, but it changed the shape of the danger. They reached the river crossing where willows bowed into the water like tired mourners. A wagon sat half hidden behind a stand of scrub. A horse stamped its hooves, restless. No one else was in sight. Elias approached the wagon and pulled back a canvas cover. Inside lay a rifle and a satchel wrapped in oilcloth. Delphine frowned. You brought supplies. Elias's mouth tightened. I planned on running. Delphine's eyes sharpened. From what? Elias looked away toward the horizon where heat shimmered. From my past, he said. Delphine reached toward the satchel but stopped herself. And from me? Elias's gaze returned to her. No. The answer was quiet, but it was true enough to hurt. Before Delphine could speak again, men appeared at the far end of the road, hard silhouettes against bright dust. The badge man was among them. They weren't alone. Delphine saw shapes that told her they had friends, 2 riders on the flank, 1 man trailing with a lantern. Elias's hand slid to the satchel strap. His breathing steadied as if his body had been waiting for this moment. Get behind the wagon, he said. Delphine's heart kicked. You're not letting me run. Elias's eyes met hers. I'm not letting you get caught alone. There was the difference. They crouched behind the wagon as bullets cracked the air. The first shots hit the ground nearby and kicked dirt into the willows. Delphine smelled gunpowder. Her fear tried to become panic, but she forced it down the way you force a horse to hold. Elias moved with deliberate restraint, not aiming wildly. He fired when the opening appeared. Delphine watched his form. He wasn't an expert shooter, not like the men who'd survived wars and learned to make violence a trade, but he was accurate enough. He had learned discipline once. Discipline lived even after the job was ruined. Shots returned. A rider's horse screamed and bolted in a half-circle. Delphine's hand shook as she gripped the folded paper. The ink on it looked suddenly fragile, like it could bleed into the dirt. Elias glanced toward her. "Don't open it," he said. Delphine startled. "Why?" "Because they'll know," he snapped, voice tight. "They'll know your hands are reading." Delphine swallowed and forced her hands to stillness. The shooting ended abruptly, replaced by shouted commands and the scrape of boots on uneven ground. They would come closer now. The badge man moved into view at the edge of the willows, lantern in hand, looking for the outline of whoever survived. Elias took a breath. Then he did something Delphine did not expect. He stood up fully, lifted his hands, and stepped into the open as if surrender had always been part of the plan. Delphine gasped. "Elias!" Elias didn't look back. His voice carried over the dust. "Gray!" he called, and the word sounded like a curse and a plea. "Orin Gray!" The men halted. The badge man's lantern swung as he stepped forward. "What did you just say?" Elias's posture remained steady even as his body looked exposed. "I'm Orin," he repeated. "I'm the one you want." Delphine pressed her fingers against the satchel strap and forced herself not to move. Because she understood. Elias was creating a new kind of record, not a photograph, a sacrifice that would buy seconds. The badge man spat to the side. "You think you can buy forgiveness with a stunt?" Elias's voice went quiet. "No. I think I can buy time." Delphine's heart hammered. The badge man lifted his rifle. "Time for what?" Elias finally turned his head toward Delphine's hiding place. His eyes held hers. Delphine saw something there that hadn't been there in the studio. Not apology, not fear, a kind of decision. He said it without words by turning his face back toward the rifle. "Now." Delphine moved. She slid behind the wagon's side and sprang into the scrub where the willows were thick. Her feet sank into soft ground. The world narrowed to the distance between her and the river and the folded paper cutting into her palm. Behind her, gunfire erupted again, but messier now, frantic. The men had to reposition. Confusion had opened the door. Delphine ran until her lungs burned. When she finally reached the riverbank, she stopped and turned just once. Elias stood in the open with his hands raised again, facing the badge man. Delphine couldn't hear his words, but she saw the badge man's face harden. Then Elias's head dipped, and he lowered his arms, not in surrender, but in offering his neck as if to say, "Take it." Delphine's eyes blurred. A woman's life could be spent on so many kinds of waiting. She refused to wait now. She gripped the paper, pulled off her shawl, and waded into the river's edge where the current carried foam. She held the paper above her head and crossed in a rush, boots slipping on stones. On the other side, she collapsed onto damp earth and breathed until her ribs stopped screaming. She didn't know if Elias survived. She didn't know if he was alive long enough to protect her any longer. But she knew the message mattered. Because while men were distracted, the West had changed shape around her. That night, Delphine found a camp by following smoke to a bend in the trail. No one asked her questions. Survival had taught people in the dying West to treat silence as currency. A woman with silver hair and hands that looked like they had been stitched from hardship met Delphine near the fire. "You're late," the woman said. Delphine swallowed. "I didn't have a choice." The woman's gaze sharpened. "Did he take you?" Delphine's stomach turned at the wording. "He hid me," she answered. The silver-haired woman nodded once, as if that was the only acceptable answer. "Then it's time." She handed Delphine a small tin lantern and pointed toward a path leading deeper into the trees. "There's a man waiting to hear what you carry," she said. "But if the wrong eyes see you, he will die with you." Delphine's throat tightened. "Where is he?" "Near the ridge where the photographers used to camp," the woman said. Delphine remembered the stories about Elias's studio, how he traveled with a camera case and slept where he could find a window of safety. So he had left traces. Delphine walked through the dark until her feet numb swam in mud. At the ridge, she found a man crouched beside rocks, coat pulled low, face half covered with a scarf. He rose when he heard her step. He was older than Carter had sounded in rumor, but not by much. His eyes were tired and watchful. "Delphine," he said, and her name on his tongue sounded like a judgment. "How do you know it?" she demanded. The man's mouth twisted. "People talk." Delphine held out the folded paper. "This is for you. Deliver it. Tell it to anyone who can keep it alive." Carter's eyes locked on the paper. He didn't reach for it. "What did they do to him?" he asked. Delphine's breath caught. "Who?" Carter's jaw clenched. "The man who took your portrait." Delphine's silence was answer enough. Carter's shoulders sagged, and the grief that washed over him looked older than his own face. "He always thought he could outrun what he'd done," Carter said. Delphine's anger flared. "You sound like you're blaming him." Carter's eyes sharpened. "I'm not. I'm acknowledging that what he did cost more than he could imagine." Delphine stared at him. "You helped create the cost." Carter flinched as if struck. Delphine hated that she had forced his honesty, hated that her love, if it had any roots yet, was being born next to blame. Because she still didn't know how she felt about Elias. Not fully, not safely. But she knew she had been saved by him, and that mattered. "Read it," Delphine demanded, thrusting the paper toward him. Carter took it carefully. He unfolded it with slow fingers. As his eyes tracked the lines, his face moved through every emotion that made men dangerous. Rage, disbelief, then resolve. He looked up at Delphine. This is bigger than a warning." "It's names," Delphine said. "It's proof. It's a bridge for the ones who come after." Carter's voice lowered. "Proof doesn't stop bullets." Delphine's gaze steadied. "No, but it stops lies, and lies are what make bullets easy." Carter stared at her for a long time. Then he nodded once. "Stay here," he said, "if you can." Delphine's brows tightened. "Why?" Carter exhaled. "Because you think your love is enough to survive, and you don't know what men will do when they realize the story can be carried." Delphine's heart dropped. He was wrong about what she had, but he was right about what she feared. She didn't want to call it love yet. She didn't want to give the word power. But her body had already started responding to Elias's presence, starting with the studio lights, the ledger, the way he stood between her and the rifle. Her feelings had grown in spite of her will. Carter took the paper and left Delphine with the night's cold breath. She sat with her back against the rocks and listened to the forest settle. In the distance, gunshots sounded, faint, like echoes from a war that refused to end. Delphine wondered if Elias's sacrifice had been only a delay, or if it had been the first step of the slow plan that would bring her message to the right hands. By dawn, Delphine returned toward town. She kept her steps light. She avoided main streets. At the corner of Elias's studio, she saw something that made her stomach turn. Fresh boot prints in the dust leading to the back door. The studio curtain hung torn. Delphine pushed inside. The room was ransacked, plates shattered, the cabinet slammed open, chemicals spilled like spilled blood. And in the middle of the floor, half on his side, half propped by a chair, was Elias. No, not Elias in her mind anymore. Oren's face haunted the man's injured body. He was alive. That was the first miracle. His shirt was torn at the shoulder. Blood had dried on his skin in streaks. His eyes opened when Delphine entered. "Don't," he rasped. Delphine froze. "Don't what?" "Don't look like that," he said. Delphine's voice broke. "Like what?" Elias's gaze flickered to the destroyed plates, then back to her. "Like you're mourning the wrong thing," he whispered. Delphine knelt beside him. Her hands hovered, unsure if touch would hurt more. "You saved me," she said. Elias's mouth twitched. I didn't. Delphine stared. You stood up. Elias cut her off weakly. I gave them a target. That ain't the same as saving. Delphine swallowed hard. But you chose. Elias closed his eyes briefly, as if the truth was too bright. I chose wrong, he said. A long time ago. I chose paperwork. I chose quiet. I chose the kind of cowardice that looks like routine. Delphine's tears spilled without permission. She wiped them away with the heel of her hand, angry at how human her body was. Why show up now? She demanded. Elias opened his eyes again. Because your face didn't feel like a lie. Delphine's breath caught. The words were simple, but they carried a weight that made the air in the studio feel too thin. You don't get to comfort me with poetry, Delphine said. Elias's voice softened. I'm not comforting you. Delphine leaned closer. Then what are you doing? Elias reached weakly toward her, stopping short of touching her. His fingers trembled. I'm asking you to hate me less, he said, and trust me more. Delphine stared. She could hate him. She could demand proof. She could walk out and never return, leaving him to bleed into the floorboards. But she had watched him stand between her and men with rifles. She had watched his body become a shield. Hate wasn't wrong, but it wasn't all she was allowed to feel. Delphine placed her hand on his wrist. Elias shivered. You're still alive, Delphine whispered. Elias's eyes softened. Barely. Delphine looked around at the wreckage of his studio. You lost your work, she said. Elias let out a weak laugh that sounded like pain. No, I lost a wall of negatives. The world still has your face in it. That's the part they can't steal, if you remember. Delphine's chest tightened. She had wanted a photograph, a record. But Elias had given her something else, a witness. A man who refused to let her become only a story told by enemies. Delphine helped him sit upright slowly. She used her shawl to clean blood from his shoulder as best she could. Elias winced but didn't pull away. His eyes stayed on her hands. Do you have the print? He asked. Delphine blinked. What print? Elias's jaw tensed. The first one. Delphine realized then what he had hidden. In the cabinet, he had tried to protect the plate. I didn't see it, she admitted. Elias's eyes closed. Then I failed. No, Delphine snapped. You didn't. Elias opened his eyes. What makes you sure? Delphine held his gaze. Because if they took everything, they wouldn't still be alive enough to destroy your studio. They would have burned it clean and left you for dead. Elias stared. Delphine continued, voice steadier now that determination had found her again. They came to stop the ledger and the message. They didn't come for art. Elias's mouth went tight. Delphine sat back on her heels and scanned the room. She found a small tin under the floorboard, wedged in the corner. She pried it open and saw a folded paper package wrapped in waxed cloth. The print. Delphine's fingers shook as she unfolded it. Her face stared back at her from the sepia-toned surface. The light caught her scar. The eyes looked steady even when she had been terrified. A photograph couldn't stop bullets, but it could stop strangers from claiming they never saw her. Elias's breath hitched when he saw it. You got it, he murmured. Delphine looked up. You hid it. Elias's eyes filled with exhaustion and something that looked like relief. I hid what mattered, he said. Delphine pressed the print into Elias's hands. Then we hide together. You don't bleed alone. Elias's fingers tightened around the photo. His voice dropped until it was almost a confession. Delphine, I never meant for you to walk into my rot. Delphine stared at him. And I never meant to fall for a man who used to wear a badge, she replied. The sentence surprised her even as it left her mouth. Elias's expression cracked. He looked like he wanted to apologize again, like apology was his only language. But Delphine reached for his hand and held it. You don't get to take back what your choices did, she said. But you don't get to pretend you're unchanged either. Elias nodded slowly. I'm not. Delphine's eyes narrowed. Then prove it. Elias swallowed. How? Delphine heard the distant shout of men outside. They were coming again. The West did not forget fights once it had started them. Delphine stood and held the print up where the window light could find it. Photograph the truth, she said. Not just me, you, Carter. Whoever will risk being seen. Elias blinked. They'll kill us. Delphine's voice steadied. Then let them. We'll give them names to choke on. Elias stared at the print, then at her. A slow smile moved across his face, not happy, but earned. You're braver than your deadlines, he said. Delphine huffed. Bravery is what happens when you've already lost too much to keep bargaining. Elias's gaze softened. He reached up and touched her cheekbone near the crescent scar without pressing. His fingers were careful, like he was afraid she might shatter. I thought you were just a stranger, he whispered. Delphine's breath caught. And you were wrong, Elias finished. At that, the world outside erupted, boots pounding, gunshots popping, voices demanding. Elias moved to the tripod despite the pain in his shoulder. Delphine helped him set up the camera again, rebuilding the studio with hands that shook but did not stop. When the door burst open, men flooded in with rifles and bright badges. The badge man's eyes swept the room. He paused when he saw Delphine holding the print. Then his gaze locked onto Elias. Orin, he snarled. Elias straightened as best he could. Call me what you like, he said. I'm done hiding. Delphine stepped forward. Here is what you can't erase, she said, and held out her photograph to the lamp. The men stared as if the paper had turned into a weapon. The badge man's face twisted with anger. That's just a picture. Delphine's voice went calm, dangerous in its restraint. It's proof. It's a promise. And it's a record of the woman you tried to use as a rumor. One of the men raised his rifle. Delphine didn't flinch. She had already crossed a river in the night. She had already survived the day when she watched a man offer himself to bullets. Elias lifted the camera lens and adjusted it with steady hands. If you shoot, he said, you'll do it on a day that will be remembered. The badge man's mouth opened. Then it closed. Because fear was never absent from cruelty, it was just buried under authority. And the authority in that room had just been made visible. Carter appeared at the doorway behind them, not charging, not dramatic, just walking in like a man finally deciding to stop being a shadow. He held another sheet of paper. The names are already out, Carter said. The badge man's eyes widened. Carter continued, voice steady. And the photographs are coming too. Silence fell like a blanket. No one knew how to respond to records that had already escaped. Elias's eyes met Delphine's. He didn't say love. He didn't need to. Delphine understood. This was how the West got rewritten, not by armies, but by witnesses who refused to look away. The men backed out slowly, not because they had become kind, but because their orders had started failing. Cruelty could last longer than kindness, but it couldn't last forever against a truth that wouldn't stay hidden. When the room finally emptied, Delphine sank onto the floor beside Elias. Her hands were cold. Her heart felt too large for her ribs. Elias slumped forward, breathing hard, but his eyes stayed on her. You okay? He asked. Delphine let out a laugh that sounded like relief and grief tangled together. I'm alive, she said. Elias reached for the photograph again and held it gently like a sacred object. Then he turned his gaze to her scar. I'm sorry, he whispered. Delphine stared at him. I didn't come here to collect apologies, she said. Elias nodded. Then what did you come for? Delphine breathed in the smell of chemicals and dust and old wood. A way to be real in a world that wants to call me impossible, she answered. Elias's eyes softened. And I found that, she added, in your room, in your hands, in what you risked. Elias's expression turned raw. He lifted his injured shoulder a fraction and then rested his forehead against hers. an intimacy that belonged to exhaustion rather than romance movies. Delphine closed her eyes. Outside, the town continued dying in its own slow way. But inside the studio, a different kind of ending had begun. The West still wanted them apart. Men still wanted their stories buried. Yet Delphine had a photograph now. Elias had a name he could no longer hide. And when the next visitors arrived, when the next round of rifles tested the door, Delphine and Elias would stand together behind the camera. Not because the West had softened, because they had decided that love, like proof, was something you carried into danger and refused to drop. Neutral studio background, soft lighting, photorealistic.